So, if anything, it pays to be punctual. Let me just turn the music down there. That ought to do it. That ought to be right. So, welcome. Thanks for joining me. And I guess depending on where you are is going to be when you are. But thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to hearing from you in the chat or the comments, and more about chat and comments in a bit. But anyway, this series is a live learning series about hazard identification, assessment, and control. Essentially what it is my opportunity to give back and have almost like a classroom setting by the week. And so we're going to deal with right from what is a hazard all the way to different types of hazard assessments within this series. I don't know how much it's going to run. It just depends on how the progress goes. But so far I've got 6 lessons in the queue, and I think there'll be 3 more after that. So likely about 9 lessons. And so it's all about hazard assessment. And I know, why? What's the point? well, like I said, one, to give back, but I've just noticed something, and I've talked about it in previous videos, is that you don't have to search far and wide to find news articles about employers being fined or sanctioned or penalized in some way, shape, or form for failing to identify, assess, and control hazards. At the very least, it's failing to control hazards. And even worse, when they're not doing that, when they're negligent about it, they're putting workers at risk. Not only that, increasing their organizational or enterprise risk too, for that matter. So hazard assessment is important. I can't stress it enough. And here's my thing. This is just anecdotal, if you will. But I think if you were to, all over the world, all of the authorities that are responsible for occupational health and safety all over the world, if you were to look through all the penalties and everything, I think you'd find a common denominator that's pretty plentiful. And that is the employers, the people at fault, failed to identify and assess hazards and control risk. I bet you. I haven't done any studies on it. I haven't had the time. But, I just think it's a good possibility that you're going to find out that's the case. I really do. But on that note, we're going to work through this. And yeah, so let's get through it and we'll go a bit into it. So once again, the series is on hazard identification, assessment, and control. And this first episode is aptly named, What is a Hazard? But more to that is why you should care. So let's deal with the first hurdle altogether, and that's understanding what a hazard is and maybe what it isn't. And we'll talk about that because there is some confusion. And if you don't know what you're looking for, how are you going to know when you find it? And if you don't know what you're looking for, how are you going to deal with it once you do find it? So that's the important thing. But let's talk about some ground rules here first. So as far as it goes, just like if you've taken part in my other streams, participate. Introductions are nice. I don't mind if you want to just sit and just, don't pick on me and don't talk to me. That's fine. I understand. I really do. But it's always nice to get to know people, and I honestly have said that I've met lots of great people through the streams and through this channel. So thank you all for participating and joining in and so forth. So just drop your introduction into the chat, who you are, where you're from, what you do, if you're new to safety, been a safety veteran for a while, and if you're catching this at a later time after the stream is live, throw it into the comment. And I do appreciate all of the feedback and all of the interaction. Now, the other thing is ask and answer. So ask questions. I can't answer them unless you ask them. And however, if you want to leave some response or some feedback in the comments and in the chat, by all means, go right ahead and do so. Your knowledge, your opinions count. And they're appreciated. It's all about forming a community and collaborating, right? Be civil, okay? No name calling, no insults, okay? Just be civil and be nice. Civility is nice. It's also professional. And on the note of professional, this is not professional advice, okay? There's no contracts being signed, no money changing hands. So it's not professional advice. Well, honestly, I am a professional and I am giving advice, but it's not to be considered that. There's no contract. Just the same as it's not a formal class. I am not sure how I'd issue a certificate. I suppose maybe I could, and let me know in the comments later on or in other videos what your thoughts are if I did have a course outline and issued a completion for people that took part in it. I don't know, something to kick around, maybe even for a later course. And if you enjoy this one, drop me a comment or throw something into the chat or send me an email of what you'd like to see as the next one. Anyway, now the process for this series is going to be a presentation, a lecture. So almost just like a PowerPoint, except I'm off to one side and there's slides coming up. And So a presentation and a lecture, and then there will be a short quiz at the end. Half a dozen questions, 5 questions, whatever the case may be. But also, if there's chat questions, by all means, I'll answer them as they come in. But on the note, if you're catching it, like I said, at a later date, leave comments. Comment questions will be answered in subsequent episodes. So I'll monitor the comments from each video, and as they come in, I'll answer them. And if they come in like 3 weeks after the initial video, by all means, I'll answer them in the following episode, provided it doesn't keep things, or it doesn't make things go too long. And if it looks like it's going to be making the videos go too long, what I'll likely do is insert a Q&A stream throughout the series. So that's that, and that's what the format's going to be. So anyway, let's get right into it. So the first thing is what is a hazard? Now, honestly, there's endless definitions, and I want you to do me a favor. Check your jurisdiction first, because regardless of what I say or other authorities or textbooks or whatever, aligning your health and safety program or your health and safety management system with your legislation is the best bet. However, that being said, it doesn't mean that you can exceed your legislative requirements, especially if adopting best practices would mean that you exceed those requirements or the existing requirements or boundaries. So you might want to consider creating your own definition if it exceeds what you have currently in the legislation. So, like I said, check your jurisdiction first. The other thing is, ask yourself, do you need to personalize your definition if there's room to expand on what the legislation says? But not only that, it adds this personal angle or this personal touch to your organization. Now, in most cases, you know what, and we're going to talk about some definitions in a bit here, but realistically, you usually don't have to go too far. But if it does lend emphasis and impact because of that personalization, it's a good thing. It really is. So here in Canada, we have an organization that's federally sponsored called the CCOHS, the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. They are a federal corporation. They're governed by a tripartite council representing government, employers, and labor. And they always work to ensure a balanced approach to workplace health and safety issues. But here's their definition. A hazard is any source of potential damage, harm, or adverse health effects on something or someone. And honestly, that spells it out quite good. Here's what we have in Alberta. I like this one because it's pretty simple, too. I like it as well. It's a situation, condition, or thing that may be dangerous to health and safety. Keeping it simple is nice. Now, for my American brethren to the south, a hazard is often associated with a condition or activity that, if left uncontrolled, can result in an injury or illness. That's a big one there when you think about it, okay? If left uncontrolled. So now, in case you haven't seen some of the latest live streams or previous videos I've had, I have a definition that I like, and it's a little bit lengthier, but understand, if you put it in its simplest terms, a hazard is something that has the potential for a negative effect on anyone or anything it interacts with. Injuries or illness, damage to property and or assets, or harm to the environment. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times what happens is, and go ahead, let me know in the comments, throw it in the chat, or send me an email, whatever. How many of you have arrived at the work site and seen damage when nobody's been there because of something that's occurred? Like, I've seen it when old sodium light bulbs exploded and caused damage, or something was worn and broke when nobody was there. Now, once again, I know if nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. Or if nobody's there, nobody gets hurt. You have to understand that that consequence was still the result of a hazard. And we'll talk about that more in a second. So once again, a hazard is something that has the potential for a negative effect on anyone or anything it interacts with. Injury or illness to people, damage to property or assets, or harm to the environment. So in other words, a hazard is something that causes those things. Keep that in your mind. Causes those things. So it's important to understand a hazard left uncontrolled leads to a loss. That's it. It's no ifs, ands, or buts. The most important thing to understand is a hazard left uncontrolled leads to a loss. Doesn't necessarily mean that loss is going to be human in nature, a person, a worker, but just the same could be a loss. So, now, something to consider, the confusing part. Too often, the mistake is made that when performing a hazard assessment, folks doing the hazard assessment focus on the result, the consequence, not the cause. Now, the cause is the hazard we need to consider, okay? And often, what you could do is consider the following descriptors. Contact with, okay? So the hazard isn't the cut, it's contact with sharp edges. A hazard isn't the abrasion, it's contact with rough surface. A hazard isn't the burn, it's contact with heat, or conversely, extreme cold. Basically, it's an influence that's going to cause injury or immediate trauma, okay? So contact with. So when you're describing your hazards, it's contact with, not cut. Does that make sense? I hope so. Or being exposed to. Being exposed to sharp edges, rough surfaces, heat, extreme cold, etc. That's that influence that's going to cause the injury, but it's also not necessarily something that can be touched. Think noise, radiation, extreme environmental temperatures, okay? So exposed to as well, okay? A lot of times when you think about it, fighter pilots are exposed to gravitational forces or extreme gravitational forces. Deep sea divers are exposed to extreme pressures. Okay? Next thing is a loss or deprivation of. While we might think we have the presence of ice on a sidewalk, it's also the loss of friction. So consider that analogy when examining a situation for hazards. Is there no presence of, or is there a loss or deprivation of? And here's one to ponder. You can leave me a comment or insert something in the chat, or if you're like watching afterwards, leave me a comment. What if you have flimsy guardrails? Yes, there's a safeguard there, but they're inadequate. Is it a deprivation of, a loss of? Just something to think about. So, next thing to think of, the presence of or the absence of, very much the same thing. Think also of those things that necessarily can't be touched, like light, for instance, but also the presence of poisonous gases, vapors, fumes, the absence of oxygen, like entering a steel enclosure. That's an environment that has the absence of oxygen. However, think also of the absence of the normal safeguards, like the absence of guardrails. Okay? Also, the reduction of or the increase of. Oxygen might not be absent, but reductions below 19.5% in the breathable atmosphere is hazardous to the health. We need to think that 20.9 or 20.78 or whatever it is, 21%. But conversely, an increase in inerting gases can also cause that reduction, but also gradual increases or other things, other accumulations, can cause problems. You know, think about that analogy of a frog boiling in water. Doesn't notice it at first, but the water starts boiling and all of a sudden frogs now soup. Just a thought. So, we need to understand what the sources of hazards are. Okay, we've talked about contact with, absence of, presence of, etc., but what are the sources of the hazards? Now, if you've watched previous videos of mine, you know that I've talked about sources of hazards, and the reason I list them the way I do is I look at them and I put them in the order where they're the most difficult to manage and influence. So the first source of hazard is people. And they could be the people doing the work, the people you work with, or depending, like think if you're in retail or healthcare or something, the people you're caring for or serving. Okay? They can also be a source of the hazard. And they're the most difficult to manage and influence. The next is the environment. Think of the working environment, the physical working environment. Think of two. Is it too hot, too cold, too light, too dark, too windy, too noisy, etc.? So it helps you to think of that environment. That's also where you might note the presence of or the absence of. And then equipment or machinery, the tools and equipment and machinery that you're working with. They're not nearly as difficult to influence as the people. But that's where you might have that contact with or that exposed to, right? And then finally, the materials you're working with. And those materials can also range from what you're cooking with, if you're a chef in a restaurant, or what you're stocking if you're working in retail and you're doing the inventory, or you're a painter and you're painting with, or you're cleaning vehicles, etc. It's also the materials you're working with. They're the easiest to influence out of all of them. So think P, people, E, environment, E again for equipment and machinery, and then materials. So there you go. Now, understand that we have to split hazards into classes. Okay, and the reason is because if we identify hazards correctly, then we can assess them correctly and control them correctly. So safety hazards, these are immediate hazards. They're likely to cause immediate trauma to the body. Think about an icy sidewalk as a safety hazard, or working at heights with no fall protection as a safety hazard. It makes it easier if you think about it as something that has the potential to have external force exerted on the body. Now, health hazards, a different class of hazard, is slightly different. They're usually more internal in nature. Okay? Think exposure to poisons, toxins, but also noise levels over a period of time, or severe and extreme noise levels, like if you're standing beside a jet engine with no protection on. Of course, why would you? But anyway, incorrect identification of hazards, let me go back to that for just a sec. Incorrect identification of hazards is going to result in an incorrect assessment for risk, and then, of course, an incorrect selection and application of controls. Okay? Now, we've talked about classes of hazards. Now we have categories of hazards. The best way to do it is to categorize them. Think of this and understand that hazards may fit under more than one category, but always when you're assessing, identifying and assessing, there are always going to be more of one thing. Okay? So you have physical hazards. And these are things that you can obviously touch. They also fall under a safety hazard. So think of ice on a sidewalk, etc. It's the physical environment. Now, chemical hazards are pretty easy to think about when you, if you're a painter, if you're an auto body person, if you're working in a construction site and you're using oil for the, well, the British call it shutter oil. It's for doing the cement forms. But if you're using and working with that stuff, that's a chemical hazard. But depending if you're in healthcare, medications also fall under medical or chemical hazards. And then, of course, biological hazards. And now, one of the things that COVID brought that to the forefront, everybody figured that out fairly quick. I hope I don't get strike for saying the C word. But anyway, molds are often a big one, especially if you're working in construction and renovation. Okay? You might experience physical in the way of asbestos or silicosis, but you might use chemicals in doing the work, like paints and so forth. But you might also note biological hazards such as molds, mildews, etc. But also things like I've had friends that were doing renovations and they had to tear down areas and they were full of mouse droppings and bat droppings. And so now you're exposed to a biological hazard. And then the last one is a psychosocial hazard. And this is things like bullying, harassment, threats, etc. Okay? So hazards adversely affect the health and safety of people and cause damage to property and assets. Plain and simple. So incorrectly identifying them means a greater exposure to risk and therefore loss. So here now, why don't we go over a few questions? And there's not a lot of people in the chat. Some people are hiding, so that's fine. You can also leave something in the comments if you want. But here's the first question. And I've said it, so it's going to be pretty easy. But why is it important to identify and categorize hazards? So once again, here's the question in hazard assessment. Why is it important to properly identify and categorize hazards? A, it provides good scientific basis. B, incorrectly identified hazards may lead to incorrect choices of controls. C, it's required by law. Or D, it helps to organize the assessments. I wonder if I get in trouble for Jeopardy music. Likely. The answer is B. Incorrectly identified hazards may lead to incorrect choices of controls. Okay, that one was good. Nobody entered anything in the chat. You're all shy. That's fine. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the questions. Or you could pause the video, try to answer it, and then watch for the answer. Your choice. The next one. What type of hazard would airborne silica dust be? Respirable silica. Is it A, chemical, or pardon me, is it A, physical, B, chemical, C, biological, or D, it's simply just dust? I better not do it because I might even get a strike for that. But the answer is it's physical. Okay? Yes, it's airborne dust, but it's a physical hazard. So, next question. What type of hazard would bullying and harassment be? So, think about that one, and it's something that's fairly new to people. But anyway, what type of hazard would bullying and harassment be? Would it be A, physical, B, chemical, C, biological, or D, psychosocial? And still shy people. Oh well. It's D, psychosocial. Oh, Sherwin, good to see you. Thanks for joining. But yes, absolutely, you're right. D, psychosocial. Okay, next one. With airborne silica dust, how would you describe the hazard? Okay, a lot of times hazard assessments might not need you to describe the hazard, but describing it helps you to better identify it, better assess it, and better control it. So with airborne silica dust, how would you describe the hazards? Would it be A, the presence of physical hazard in the air? B, the absence of fresh breathable air? C, not having available masks? Or D, unable to breathe? And for those of you that answered A, well done. It is the presence of physical hazard in the air. We have to remember that that physical hazard is, and it's a health hazard, but it's also a safety hazard at the same time, but it's present in the respirable air. So what it's doing is we're taking it into our bodies and creating that health hazard. So here's the next one. The outside sidewalks are covered in ice. How would you describe the hazards? It's the presence of a physical hazard on the sidewalk, the absence of friction on the walking surface, or the presence of unguarded hazards or loss of balance. This is a tough one. Okay, well, the answer is it's the presence of a hazard on the sidewalk. I know you're thinking it's the absence of friction, and if you'd have said that too, I would have been fine with that too. Right on. Good stuff, Sherwin. I would have been fine with that too, but realistically, it's the presence of. We don't necessarily think of the absence of something in most cases unless the absence creates the hazard. Yeah, so there you go. And so any questions that anybody wants to enter into the chat and I can answer? Oh, there was people and people left. Maybe they'll come back. I found that quite a bit on the live streams, is that people will drop in, have a quick look and think, oh, okay, I'll watch this later. I hate to say it, but I often do the same thing on YouTube too. So, yeah. However, once again, if you think of a question regarding what is a hazard and you want to enter it into the comments, feel free. I'll answer them in the next stream. Coming up next is understanding the difference between, and this is also a difficult point, not properly identifying what a hazard is the first mistake that's made. People saying, well, the hazard is falling, or the hazard is tripping, or the hazard is getting burnt, things like that. So they look at the consequence. That's why it's important to understand hazard versus risk versus consequence and putting them in context. So that's what we'll be looking at next. So once again, questions in the comments will be answered in subsequent episodes or live streams, and I will be picking up the Saturday live streams, not this Saturday, but the following Saturday. And the first one's going to be on the first element in a health and safety management system, which is management commitment. So policy and management commitment and how that affects the safety culture. I know, kind of esoteric and out there, but believe it or not, here's an interesting saying that you can think about. Okay? And think about this. When people just poo-poo safety culture and think about all sorts of things. Strategy is great, but culture always beats strategy. Yeah, great. So, for those of you that did join, and Sherwin, thank you for hanging out in the stream, and I hope to see you in the next one. I hope you found some of this helpful. But, and hey, if my email address is, you can go onto my channel page and hit it up and you can find my email address. Go ahead and hit me up and email me if you think of some good hazard assessment or hazard identification questions that you would think would be good. And you know what? I'll give you an honorable mention. I'm just a poor YouTuber. I can't afford to pay anybody. But I'll definitely give you honorable mention in subsequent streams and so forth. So thank you very much for joining. And like I said, if you have any questions, drop them into the comments and I'll definitely handle them and deal with them in the next segments. I appreciate everyone's comments. I surely do. Just in the same token, hit me up, subscribe to the channel, share it out with friends if you want. Yeah. So anyway, take care. And remember, do me a favor. It's not about having a title. It's not about, and I've heard it before, I need to have leader in my title. I need to have manager. No, you don't. Leadership emerges when people need to do the right thing at the right time. And so when you're doing the right thing at the right time, regardless of people watching, you're provoking safety. You really are. So think about that one, okay? Take care. Bye for now.